Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Leo Costello, multimedia producer here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week I'm talking to our co-president, Dan Barker, about his new book, Contraduction. That's not to be confused with Contradiction, right? And this is what, your 11th book in the free thought genre, Dan?
That's right.
Yeah. So as always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. So please leave your comments and questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show. And before we begin, there is a bit of an elephant in the room, pun intended, I suppose. We are recording the show on November 6, 2024, and Donald Trump just won the presidential election for the second time. This has been a difficult morning for the FFRF staff and possibly for you as well. And we do plan on talking about the election during next week's show. There's a lot to discuss, so we wanted time to prepare. In the meantime, we will be releasing a statement at ffrf.org, but we will be talking about this next week.
Well, and of course, viewers should know and do know from our history that FFRF is not giving up. This is a real serious blow to state-church separation, which is what our group's all about. And we're going to continue fighting, continue marching, continue agitating. We're going to keep doing what we do and more, because that very important American principle of the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause separating state and church needs to be preserved. And so our attorneys, our staff, are going to be gearing up in the months to come to keep buttressing that wall of separation.
Absolutely. So again, we will be talking about the election results and, looking ahead at the next 4 years next week. But for today, we're going to try to distract you from the news cycle for about an hour or so and talk about this book, Dan. So the very first sentence of your book, Contraduction, Dan, you say the concept of contradiction was conceived standing up during a debate you did in 2022 with Christian theologian Adam Lloyd Johnson. And the debate was over the question, does God exist? And you pointed out a fallacy in his argument. Let's play a clip from that debate where you begin to form this concept of contradiction.
There needs to be a word for this. It's not really a fallacy, but it's like when your premise is backwards. When you think that the rivers, the state borders came first and the rivers came later. It's like Vic Stenger, he wrote the book, The Fallacy of Fine Tuning. He's an astrophysicist. He just died recently. Vic Stenger said, the universe is not fine-tuned for us. We are fine-tuned for the universe. And yet, there's a fallacy that happens in the making of your premise that somehow this design is evidence when it's a backwards kind of inside-out thinking. I think we need a new word. We have deductive logic, which is pretty powerful for formulating hypotheses that are solid conclusions. We have inductive logic, which is pretty good, it's weaker for generating some premises. We have what Adam called abductive logic, which really is just a fancy word for your best guess. And that's okay when you're trying to solve a crime. You're looking for a prime suspect. Actually, prime suspects are people who do exist, right? But I think we need another kind of a word called maybe post-ductive logic, where it's kind of like the post hoc fallacy. The rooster crows every morning and the sun comes up. Wow, powerful rooster, right? Wow. Of course, we all see the illogic of that. Well, Adam is making the same mistakes when he's talking about fine-tuning. He's assuming a certain temporal causality here, even with the so-called formation of the Big Bang, admitting that space and time came into existence at the Big Bang, and he gets saying something must have come prior. How can you describe prior to time? Time is a dimension. What is higher than height? What is broader than width? It's a dimension that we're talking about, and yet Adam seems to be talking about them as if they were things, as if time somehow could exist outside of time, which is not a coherent concept.
So, Dan, you came up, you're on the spot there in that debate, and you came up the word post-ductive logic. I'm curious, what made you change the term to contradiction?
Well, so you can tell I was thinking on my feet, because during Adam's opening, he was talking about the fine-tuning argument, and he says, I'm going to be arguing with abductive reasoning, that an inference to the best explanation of how do we explain this appearance, this design, apparent design in the universe.
And for those who don't know, the fine-tuning argument is just like the world seems so perfectly designed for us, there must be a creator, right?
Yeah, all the constants and parameters and ratios of the universe are so, if any of them had been even slightly different, life would not exist. How do you explain that? So he said, using abductive reasoning, which as I said during the debate, is just sort of your best guess to the best explanation. And I thought about the word abductive, because you don't hear it that often, you know. Sometimes it's called retroductive reasoning. And so on the spot I said, I think we need a new word. So I used the word postductive, and the audience was not impressed. And they should not have been impressed, because that's not the right word. It was months later, as I was thinking this through, about this backward, inside-out thinking, that I realized that I needed a prefix that doesn't mean after, but a prefix that means inverted. And so that's why contraductive came to my mind, and that's now a word.
And those are both ends of that word are both like Latin, comes from Latin terms.
Because duct, the Latin word duct is to lead or to flow, to lead to. So deductive is downward leading, inductive is inward leading, abductive is away leading, and so contraductive is opposite leading.
So if you would have come up with that word contraduction, maybe the audience would have just gone crazy.
Well, who knows? But I did use the word for the first time in public at my debate in Oxford a year ago, and I said, I'm going to use this for the first time, and there's a new book coming out. So it's a word now, and you might think it's a typo, like you said, because, you know, on the keyboard, the I and the U are right next to each other.
Yeah, what is the difference between contradiction and contraduction? Because you could imagine how someone might mistake the two, because to contradict is to go against something, and that seems like what contraduct is, so what's the difference?
Well, to contradict is to say the opposite of what somebody else is, or to say something other, to say what they're saying is wrong. And they're kind of parallel concepts, because like if I contradict you, that doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. It just means that one of us is mistaken here. But to contraduct means to take an idea and totally flip it around backwards from the human point of view. And the example I was giving in the debate there was, I had said before that it's like the person who's amazed, how did they make all those rivers flow right along the state border? How did they do that?
What are the odds that would happen?
You know, and so that must have been an expensive civic project to get those rivers to flow exquisitely fine-tuned to the borders. Well, that's silly. That's backward, because the rivers came first and the borders came later. So it's backward thinking. And in the book I give like a couple dozen examples.
Yeah. So that example you just gave is obviously a silly one to sort of prove your point. But the example that you gave in your book that I thought was really helpful was the analogy of the mirror. And actually, we have a couple graphics from the book we could probably pull up. Can you talk about how it relates to the mirror illusion that we see every day? So
there's a chapter called Reflection, and it's an example of contraduction. When you look in the mirror, it looks like the right and left are reversed. And it's like if you're looking at another person, their hair's parted on the left, but it's parted on the right. But actually, a mirror does not reverse left and right. If your left hand's to the west, your left hand's to the west, and then to the east. What a mirror reverses is not left and right, it reverses front to back.
Yeah.
So like if you point at yourself in the mirror north, it's pointing to you south. So it's a flip in this direction. And it's curious, and even Einstein wondered about this, why doesn't a mirror also reverse top to bottom? Have you ever thought of that?
Yeah.
Even if you're lying on your side, it's still the top is the top. Why is that? So there's this idea of symmetry. So the way to unreverse this contradiction in the mirror is, imagine you're holding a piece of paper with your photograph on it. You're going to be looking at yourself like someone else would look at you, right? Where the right and left do not correspond. But turn the paper around and hold it up to the light and look through the paper, and then you'll see it where your right and left do correspond. There's a direct line correspondence to you. You're looking through it. So when you look at a mirror, imagine that that the image is not looking at you, but that the image is looking with you, away from you, following the path of light that it would have taken if the mirror had not interfered with it. So that's a flip. And by the way, mirrors do actually reverse top to bottom if you put them on the floor. If you put it on the floor, then you'll see what was up was down and what's down is up. So it's a complete reversal.
And another example of contradiction, and an everyday example you give in the book is if you're in a train, it starts moving, and you're not, you think you're moving, but it was just another train that was moving.
Yeah.
You know, your presuppositions of what is reality is flipped around. So any thought you have is going to be wrong because you're contradicting reality, right?
You're contradicting.
Contradicting.
Yeah.
There we go.
It's like introduce, introduction, deduce, deduction.
Okay.
So, in fact, Anu Garg, who runs that Word a Day, he wrote out a nice definition of the word, the verb, the adjective, and all that.
I think I made a graphic for that. We've been showing it a couple times. There you go.
Yeah, so Anu Garg came up with that basic. Oh, that's a different one. That's the one that I came up with. But anyway, but that works. It's not in the dictionary yet, so we can mess around with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Like if you're sitting on the train, the problem that happens when you're sitting on the train and the other train starts to move, the problem is that you are always looking at, and I think every organism does that. We assume everything's from our point of view, and that's where the mistake happens. So a big ancient contradiction is the sunrise. We call it sunrise, right?
Right. Because that's how we're seeing it.
That's how we see it.
Right.
So we call it the sunrise. The sun is not rising. We are rising. We're coming up around and we're seeing, and so the sun is there. But for millennia, people thought it was the sun rising. And if you're a flat earth, geocentrist person, looking at life from the human point of view, you're going to think the whole universe is about you and spinning around you. And people were put to death and persecuted for trying to correct that contradiction. Galileo it was persecuted. Bruno was actually burned at the stake for that. And the church it went against the church teachings that the sun goes around the earth. So it's a mistake that our brains make because we assume from our point of view that we are the center and we are the...
And we do this all the time with things you might not even realize. I mean, apart from the earth, it's just a natural instinct we have because even though we now understand that the sun isn't rising, right? We still call it the sunrise because that's how it looks to us.
Yeah,
it makes me think of another example that is actually pretty fitting for our organization is George Carlin in one of his specials is talking about the so-called sanctity of life. And he goes, well, of course we like life. We're alive. You know, you don't hear a lot of dead people voicing their opinions on the sanctity of life. You know, we value life because we're alive. And of course, there's nothing wrong with valuing life, but it's just another example of that contradiction. So it seems like such an obvious concept that I'm surprised there already isn't a word for this. So why do you think there was not a word for this specific phenomenon?
Well, people have talked about that. We get things backward. Sometimes we get things wrong. But there never has been a word. And it looked like a fruit that was just hanging there. There's a word ready to be used that describes this concept. And I think what happens is when you do put a word to something, then it becomes easier for you to identify it. You can go, oh, okay, so that's what that is. So that's what that is. So putting a word to it kind of brings it, and it's not just religion, and it's not just moving trains, but it can be any philosophical mistake. And the reason I brought this whole thing up is because of the design argument, the fine-tuning argument. Like you say, we assume that it's all about us. And so people who use the fine-tuning argument assume that the universe is teleological. The universe was aiming at us, life. And so if anything was slightly different in the universe, any constant was off, life would not exist, and wouldn't that be a tragedy? And that's because of our self-centered value of our life as the be-all and end-all. So I'm calling it the death of a design argument, because we're not looking for an intelligent designer. We're looking for, in the universe, an intelligent observer, which is reverse from what we would normally think.
The main takeaway I took from your book is that we are constantly lied to by our own brains, and we have an implicit bias to perceive things from our own point of view. So it's important to step back and ask ourselves, are we approaching this the right way? Do we have things flipped around? And it's important to try flipping things around just to see how it feels, because if you don't question that the train next to you is moving, maybe you might never know. So it's important to be able to step back and take a look at those things.
Well, that's a pretty brief example. I mean, most of us correct it pretty quickly. But another silly example is look at the shape of the human nose. Look how perfectly designed it is to support a pair of eyeglasses. How do you explain that, right? Well, that's contradictive. That's a reversal. So, the danger comes from, if you're building a logic, if you're building a syllogism with premises and then a conclusion, if your premise is contradictive and backwards and you don't know that, you can have a perfectly valid argument with a perfectly valid conclusion that's totally unsound, that's totally untrue.
So can you talk a little bit more about how contraduction, you call, like you said, you call it the death of the design argument. Let's talk a little bit more about how you said, so the design argument is saying there must be a grand designer, but you're saying that's all wrong. You have to look for a grand observer. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, because there's the anthropic principle that the only kind of universe we could observe is the universe in which observers would exist. There might be a multiverse of other universes where there are no observers, and they're just being beautiful all by themselves, without any life in it at all. So we think that since we exist, the universe is here for us. And it's like when I quoted Vic Stenger. Vic Stenger wrote a book called The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning. He was a longtime member of FFRF, an astrophysicist who wrote a number of great books. And he said, the mistake is the universe was not fine-tuned for us. We were fine-tuned for the universe. We evolved to fit.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not like we were created out of nothing for this thing. It's just these were the circumstances that this universe was in, so along came us. And if things were slightly different, we would come up a different way, and we'd be asking the same question.
Or somebody else, or some other life form, or, and it's not necessarily terrestrial life that is the goal. But if you think it is, that's teleological. That's what the design arguments are. They think there's a purpose and a goal to all of this, when it's the other way around. We just happen to be what we happen to be. And if there are other universes, and I'm not arguing for a multiverse, but the concept of a multiverse can be useful, not because it's proved, because God's not proved either, right? The Supreme Being is not proved. It's a hypothesis that Adam Johnson was raising during his debate. And what you can say is, well, if you're going to posit a hypothesis that has no evidence and that's not proved yet to explain the appearance of fine-tuning, well, I can also posit an explanation that's still not proved, but at least it's plausible. The multiverse, what the multiverse does is it raises the numerator, which gives you more rolls of the dice. So if there's many, many trillions of universes, then it wouldn't be surprising that some of them would have the right constants to be life-permitting, while most of them would not.
Or forget universes, just how many galaxies are in our universe. The odds are still pretty good.
Well, okay,
there.
but those galaxies all fit the same constants. They're all in the same universe of.
They all follow the same rules.
Yeah, the variables and constants are all the same in all those. But if there were other universes where they were different, because the fine-tuning argument assumes that these were tuned, which means they could have been tuned differently, which means they might have been different, in which case the universe that existed might have been a different universe. So what you can say is, if you're going to posit this hypothesis, then I can posit this, and what they do is they cancel out. It's like imaginary numbers in an equation. They're going to cancel out. Or like matter and antimatter. So until either one of those comes up with evidence, if you come up with evidence for the multiverse, and there may be indirect ways to do that, or if you come up with evidence for a supreme being, then we can ask if either one of those is responsible for the appearance of fine-tuning.
So you also say in the book that contraduction is also a good argument against the Colam cosmological argument. Can you give a brief explanation on what that argument is and how contraduction applies?
So I don't say the Colam is necessarily an example of contraduction, but I do mention the Colam. Colam is an Arabic word. It goes back to early Islamic theology, which said that there's an impossibility of an infinite series of preceding events. Because if the preceding events before today was infinite, we never could have traversed it to get to now. But we have got to now, which means which means it wasn't infinite. There must have been a beginning. The Colam, the early Colam, the Muslims were saying that proves there was a beginning, a first cause. And modern apologists are linking that with Big Bang cosmology, which we now know, which most scientists now assume is true, that there was a Big Bang, however it's defined. And so the Colam says, anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe had a cause. And that looks like a seductive argument on its face, and it is valid on its face. But if you look at both of those premises, you can question both of them. In fact, you can even see some subtle monotheism in the first one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, when most things that begin to exist have more than one cause. They have multiple causes, which fits nicely with the idea of a multiverse or polytheism. So I do discuss the Colam in the sense of showing how it's a category error. There's a category error in the Colam, and there's a category error in the fine-tuning argument. And that anytime you use the word "the universe" in an argument, you're assuming that the universe inherits all of the properties of its elements. It'd be like saying, Bertrand Russell said this. We can say that every human being has a mother, right? Does that mean the human race has a mother? So we can say that everything in the universe has a cause. Does that mean that the universe has a cause? That's a category error is what it's called. You're jumping up a category.
Sure, and even if you were to say there is a cause, it's another leap to say it's a supreme being, and then it's another leap to say it's the supreme being that I specifically worship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or then you get instead of the turtles all the way down, you get the gods all the way up, because who created God, and then who created that God, and where did that God come from?
Yeah, I can't help but wonder if there was a God in heaven and all that, and I ended up there. I couldn't help but think especially if I was up there for eternity, at some point I wonder, okay, who created all this? It never ends.
Well, yeah, if there was a God, imagine this God sitting there thinking, here I am, I exist, how did I get here? I don't know. And I have moral principles. Where did they come from? And I have desires. And I guess the theologians tell me I've always existed, I guess, whatever that means. So, it becomes an infinite thing. So,
and I like the example you brought up earlier, like you can't exist before time because time is a measurement. Like what's wider than a width? It sounds nice. It sounds philosophical and neat, but it doesn't really mean anything.
Well,
right?
A lot of them will say that God exists outside of time. Therefore, there's no contradiction. And I have a chapter on free will that talks about that, because in order to have free will, you have to be ignorant of the future. And if you know the future, you can't have free will, because if you know what you're going to choose. So God can't have free will because if God knows what he's going to do at 12 noon tomorrow, then he's powerless to change it, right? And he doesn't have freedom to change it. So he doesn't have what we would call personal free will. So a lot of apologists claim that, well, God exists outside of time. Aha,
That's
see?
convenient. Yeah.
Yeah, so then God can know the future, even though the future was freely chosen. He can still know that it was freely. But what does that even mean, to exist outside of time? What does the word exist even mean? To exist means to occupy space-time. And if it doesn't occupy space-time, the word exist means something like a concept. We have concepts that exist in our brains. So before they even use that phrase, God existing out of time, they have to define what that means, and they can't. There's no way to explain how something can exist outside of time. And since we do know from current Big Bang cosmology, assuming that it's true, that time itself is a result of the Big Bang, just like the other dimensions, time is a dimension, then it is totally meaningless to talk about what came before time. Like I think I said, what is wider than width? What is the beginning of height? There is no beginning of height. It's not a thing. It's just a concept.
Yeah. Well, talking more about using contraduction as a label for fallacy in an argument, religious or not, I'm curious, how do you determine what is when an argument is contradictive or not? Like, how do you know when to apply this line of thinking?
So the argument would not be contradictive. The premise would be.
Okay. Well, okay, so let me rephrase.
Yeah.
How do you know when a premise is contradictive or not?
Well, you don't. The best way to do it is to get outside of yourself, become your own science experiment, and try to look at things from some point of view other than your own personal point of view, other than me and my life and the human species and terrestrial existence being the be-all and end-all. The way to do that is to think like a scientist and assume nothing. And if you can do that, you can often spot contradictions, and you can say, oh, my premise to begin with is totally wrong. So like the design argument, we've never observed design without a designer. The universe was designed, therefore the universe had a designer. That's kind of the rough way they explain the design argument. But is it true that we've never observed design without a designer? Is that true? That depends what you mean by design. And usually when it comes down to it, they don't mean design by natural law, because a snowflake is designed by something. We don't imagine some little fingers came and put all of the molecules by some intelligent design. We can explain it through impersonal laws of nature. Or the design of a beaver dam or a bird nest. We say, well, was that designed? Well, we can explain that by the survival instincts of those creatures that had to do those things. We can explain them through non-personal ways. I doubt that any beaver is consulting blueprints, when he's making the dam. So what they mean by design then is not those things. What they mean by design is like machines that were intelligently designed by humans. But that's
intentionally creating something from scratch to be the way it is now. It is kind of what they mean, right?
Yeah, so what they mean by design is, of course, intelligent design in the first place. They're smuggling their conclusion into the premise. The premise is already assuming what it's trying to prove. So that's called begging the question.
Have you thought at all about, or have you gotten any criticism or response when you propose the contradiction argument in a debate? What is the response?
Well, so some readers of the book, some pre-readers, and there's more than 40 pre-readers, which have been very helpful. Some of them have told me that, well, I disagree with your chapter about time. I have a chapter where I say I don't think time's flowing. I think we are flowing. Just like the sun's not rising, we are rising.
Yeah, you say something about the past and the future all being in the present, or something like that.
There is no such thing as the past or the future, and the impossibility of time travel for various reasons. So some readers have said, in fact, a physicist told me that he disagreed with my conception of how time flows, and philosophers and scientists are all disagreeing. There's A theory, there's B theory, there's eternalism, there's presentism. There's all these different concepts that no one agrees what time is. Everybody seems to have an idea. And I even say in the book, you might disagree with my conception of time, but I'm using it as an example of contradictory thinking. And what's interesting that the people who have disagreed with one or more chapters of this book have not disagreed with the concept of contraduction itself. They'll say things like, oh, your chapter about mirrors, I don't think that's contradictory, but they're using the word contradictory. So I consider that progress.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially because in the book, you introduce the concept, and then you basically take a look at it through multiple different lenses, such as time, the universe, sleep, reflection, life, morality, free will, design, really simple, basic stuff, right? But the concept itself is pretty simple. I mean, this is a fairly short book. I mean, I'm a fairly slow reader, and I was able to get it done in a few sittings. So, do you think more people will take on this concept? Do you think it's a useful concept to bring up in these kind of philosophical debates? Like, where do you plan on this word going?
Well, I think the main takeaway from this book is the design argument. Many of the examples are just examples. Like sleep, for example. We ask, what is the purpose of sleep? But really, isn't that backwards? Shouldn't we be asking, what is the purpose of wakefulness? Maybe sleep is the default, and sleep doesn't need to be explained, but wakefulness needs to be explained. So there's an example there. The author of the book, Why We Sleep, said that he thinks wakefulness is low-level brain damage. And the longer you're awake, the more brain damaged you feel. You want to go back to your natural state. And you can even apply that to death, life and death. Being alive is a temporary vacation, let's say, or a temporary escape from the natural state of not being alive. So we can contraduce a lot of different things. But I think the main takeaway here is when it comes to arguments that are talking about design and fine-tuning.
All right. Well, at this point in the show, we would go to some audience questions. We do have a fairly active live chat today, but it seems like people are very upset about the election. That's all people are really talking about, and we will be talking about that next week. We just want to make sure that we are getting the right message out there, and our staff are working hard on getting that ready.
We'll be putting out some press releases, and we'll be putting out some comments, and ramping up our strategies for challenging violations of state-church separation, because we still have a constitution. It's questionable whether we still have a democracy, but we do have a constitution. And of course, it can be interpreted different ways, but we think if we stick with our constitution and keep fighting and keep challenging these violations, and don't let those Christian nationalists get away with crossing the line, groups like ours and other groups are going to be agitating and be more and more important in the next few years.
Well, what other books have you written in the, in case people don't know, in the free thought genre? Because I think you said this is your, I think those are all your books up there on your screen there. This is your, 11th, 12th?
This is the 11th free thought book, yeah. Well, there's Mere Morality, there's Free Will Explained, then God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. That was a line by Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. And he actually asked me to write this book to document every one of those nasty adjectives of God that he put in his book. That's not good bedtime reading. Life-driven purpose, you can see life-driven purpose is contradiction, because, Rick Warren's book, Purpose-Driven Life, where it's life-driven purpose
is
a reversal.
There you go.
And so a purpose-driven life is top-down. It's like a master, a lord, a sovereign king, or a military commander, telling you what to do.
The purpose is the sacred thing, But here you're putting...
But here we flip it. Instead of, there's no purpose of life, because that would make us submitting to somebody else's marching orders. But that's not to say there's no purpose in life. We flip it around and say, instead of purpose-driven life, we have life-driven purpose, bottom up. And purpose comes from trying to solve problems, trying to meet challenges in our life. And each one of us chooses what we want to do with that.
While you were talking about your books, we actually did get a couple questions related to contradiction. So this one is from Catherine Palm. They ask, is contraduction an inductive or deductive fallacy?
It's neither.
Neither.
Contraduction can be a fallacy in a deductive premise or in an inductive premise, either way. So contraduction is not bad reasoning or good reasoning. It's a mistake. It's a fallacy that our brains unknowingly make. It's an innocent fallacy. It's a hidden fallacy that we make before we even form the premise in either a deductive or inductive argument or an abductive argument.
Another question here from How to Rule an Asteroid. Great username, by the way. Does Dan do any public speaking engagements like Blue Water, Atheist Humanists, and Agnostics Conference in Canada? Where can we find him? We actually have our own convention that we just did, but you do a lot of speaking engagements.
Well, I've spoken twice at the Blue Water in Sarnia. And yeah, I do debates. I do speaking for different groups, some of our chapters, humanist groups. And in fact, next week I'll be giving 2 talks in Mexico City. And 2 weeks ago, I performed in Nigeria. And we'll be doing some other things around the country as well.
Yeah, you're a real globetrotter. I think that is all we have for questions today. So if you're interested in Dan's concept of contraduction, his book explores the fallacy through multiple lenses, including time, the universe, life, morality, free will, evolution, the basics, real basics. So Dan, if people want to read your book, where can they go?
Well, FFRF has it in its catalog. And by the way, I donated copies to FFRF's bookshop, so there's no conflict of interest. All the proceeds go directly to help the Freedom from Religion Foundation. That's ffrf.org/shop. You can find all of those books and other books, dozens of other books as well, plus products that will help us keep marching and keep agitating in this current political and religious climate.
Yeah, absolutely. Our work, unfortunately, is becoming more important than ever, I fear. Well, that wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, airs this weekend, where Dan and FFRF's other co-president, Annie Laurie Gaylor, will speak with Josh Cowan about the effectiveness of taxpayer-funded vouchers in private schools.
Vouchers are any number of policy programs that divert taxpayer funding toward private schools. About 90% of those private schools in the U.S. are religious schools. So at their core, vouchers are tax subsidies for these religious providers of education. They are becoming increasingly common. So the first modern voucher program was formed in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, in a very small program. But over the last few years, and especially over the last 2 years, now almost 24 states have some form of a voucher system, and more are spreading along the way.
You'll be able to watch that episode soon on FFRF YouTube channel and TV stations around the country. And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. You can find that at ffrf.org/radio. And finally, you can also follow the We Dissent podcast. It's the only podcast exclusively hosted by women constitutional lawyers talking about church-state separation issues, including one of our own. You can find that at we-dissent.org. And finally, you can check out all the work we're doing at the FFRF at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you very much. If not, please come and join us. We're doing a lot of important work, trying to have some fun while doing it. And we'll see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.